The 4 stages of life. Which one are you in? Carl Jung. Carl Jung observed that a life is not one long unbroken note. It is a piece of music written in 4 movements, and most of the ache we carry comes from trying to play the wrong movement at the wrong time, still practicing scales when the concert has already begun, or still performing for a hall that emptied years ago. Here is where I want to start, with a line from Heraclitus that Jung returned to again and again in his own writing, because Heraclitus said, "The way up and the way down are one and the same," a fragment so old it predates the word psychology by 2,000 years. And Jung would stop you right there and say, "Do you see it? The sun rising over the eastern hills is not a different sun from the one sinking in the west. It is the same arc, the same fire, only turning. And if you fight the turning, if you insist that the climbing hour must last forever, you will suffer not because life betrayed you, but because you refused the shape life was always going to take." And I think most of us, if we are honest tonight, are gripping some part of that arc with white knuckles, trying to hold a stage of life that has already quietly finished with us. So let me offer you 3 sentences, and then a single line I want you to speak with me. First, I stop measuring my life by where I think I should be, and start asking honestly what season I am actually standing in. I stop treating the discomfort of change as a sign that something has gone wrong and start treating it as a sign that something is trying to turn. Third, I let the part of me that has outgrown its old shape actually finish outgrowing it. Instead of holding the shell together with willpower, and now say it with me, I make the unconscious conscious. And again, slower this time, I make the unconscious conscious. Good. And if this kind of thinking is new to you, or if it is old and welcome, I would gently ask you to subscribe so that tomorrow's teaching finds you the same way this one did, quietly, and on time. Before the first key, I want you to do something small. Type the words "face it" in the comments below, not as a performance, just as a private marker, a way of saying, "Yes, I am looking at this honestly tonight." And if something in you went quiet just now reading that, let that quiet be your answer already. The first key is that childhood is not yet a life of your own, and I know how strange that sounds, because we tend to think of childhood as the most innocent, most purely ourselves stretch of the whole arc, but Jung taught something quieter and stranger than that. He taught that, in the earliest years, the child has no continuous memory strong enough to call itself a fully separate psyche. The boundary between the child's inner world and the parent's inner world is porous, almost non-existent. The child lives, psychologically, inside the atmosphere the parents generate, their unspoken fears, their unlived ambitions, their marriage, their silence at the dinner table. All of it seeps in before there is a wall built to keep it out. This is why Jung paid such close attention to children's dreams and children's neuroses, not because the child was broken, but because the child was often carrying, without knowing it, the unlived material of the household around him. Imagine a boy who becomes anxious every time his father leaves for work, and the anxiety is not really his own fear, it is the mother's unspoken dread about the marriage, absorbed by the child the way a sponge absorbs water without deciding to. And imagine too a quieter household, an ordinary Tuesday evening, a father who never once raised his voice, but who came home each night carrying a silence so heavy it filled the whole kitchen, and his daughter, only 7, learned to move carefully around that silence long before she had any words for what it was. She did not know she was learning it. She only knew that some rooms felt safe to laugh in, and some did not. And 30 years later, she may still find herself going quiet in rooms that remind her of that kitchen, without ever tracing the thread back to its true beginning. This is the strange work of the first stage. The child is not yet writing the story. The child is only the paper the household writes on. And this is the first stage. And its task is not achievement. Its task is simply the slow, unglamorous work of becoming a separate person at all. A genuine individual, undivided, distinct. And most of us do not remember choosing to leave this stage. We simply grew a boundary, year by year, the way a shoreline slowly grows a reef. one small assertion at a time, one private opinion kept to yourself, one quiet refusal to feel exactly what the room wanted you to feel. If you are watching this and thinking of your own childhood, do not go looking there for blame. Go looking there only for information. What atmosphere did you absorb? What was never said aloud in your house that you have been carrying quietly ever since? What mood filled the kitchen before you had any name for moods at all? That is the first stage, not a golden age to return to, and not a wound to nurse forever. Simply the ground floor the rest of the building stands on. The floor you did not pour yourself and cannot go back and re-pour. Only build honestly upon. I build my house. I do not blame the ground it stands on. The second key is that youth is the morning of life, and its whole business is expansion, going outward. The young person builds a persona, takes on a role, chooses a mask that lets them meet the world. And Jung was firm that this is not vanity, it is necessary. A young person without a workable mask cannot get a foothold anywhere, cannot get the job, cannot court the partner, cannot enter the room. So the child who spent its early years absorbing the atmosphere of the household now has to do something almost opposite. It has to narrow its focus, commit to an identity, plant a flag. I am this and not that. I will become a lawyer, a mother, a craftsman, a soldier, a wife. And this narrowing feels, from the inside, like growth, like finally becoming somebody. And it is, but it is also a kind of necessary illusion. Because the young person believes, has to believe, that the identity they are building is the whole truth of who they are. Imagine a young man convinced that success in his father's business is simply who he is, not a role he has adopted but his very essence. And this conviction is exactly what lets him work 80-hour weeks without resentment, exactly what lets him sacrifice, court, marry, build. The illusion is load-bearing. It is holding up an entire structure of accomplishment that could not be built by someone who saw through it too early. Let me give you the ordinary shape of this. Picture a young woman, 26, 3 months into her first real job. She wakes before 6, rehearses in the mirror the version of herself who is competent, unshaken, always prepared. She walks into meetings and speaks in the voice of that version. She goes home and calls her mother and describes her day entirely in terms of that version. And by midnight, lying awake, some small quiet part of her wonders whether the confident one in the mirror is a costume or is simply her now. And Jung would say, gently, do not rush to answer that question yet, because the costume is doing exactly what a costume at this stage is supposed to do. It is letting her walk into rooms she has not yet earned the natural authority to walk into on her own. This is why Jung was almost tender toward the necessary blindness of youth. He did not want it stripped away prematurely. A person told at 22 that their ambitions are just a persona, just a mask, is a person robbed of the very energy they need to build a life at all. The mask is not the lie, the mask is the scaffolding, and scaffolding is not meant to be admired. It is meant to be used until the building can stand on its own. Consider too the young father who throws himself entirely into being the provider, defining every hour by what it earns his family, measuring a good day only by the number on the paycheck or the pride in his own father's eyes. And consider the young craftsman who becomes, in his own mind, indistinguishable from his craft, unable to separate his worth from the quality of the object in his hands. Both of them are doing the identical work under different names, narrowing the enormous unformed potential of youth down into one workable channel. And Jung would remind you that this narrowing is not a tragedy. It is the price of entry into any real life at all. Think of the alternative. A young person who refuses to commit to any single identity, who keeps every door open forever, out of a fear of choosing wrong. And what looks like open-mindedness quickly curdles into a kind of paralysis. Nothing built, nothing risked, nothing to show the world, or even to show yourself. So the mask, chosen and worn with conviction, is actually the more honest path, even though it is, technically, an incomplete picture of the whole self. And here is the part that Jung wanted young people to hear least and understand most. This stage is not meant to last. The very success of the morning identity plants the seed of its own limitation. The harder you narrow, the more of yourself gets left outside the frame, waiting. And this is not a flaw in the process. It is the process. A tree does not grieve that its trunk does not also contain the branches, yet the branches come later, in their own season. So if you are young, or if you are simply still living by a morning program decades after morning should have ended, do not mistake the mask for a life sentence. Wear it, use it, let it get you into rooms you could not otherwise enter, and trust that the parts of you it leaves out are not lost, only waiting, patiently, for an afternoon that is already, quietly, on its way. I wear the mask that lets me build, and I do not mistake it for my whole face. The third key is that somewhere near the middle of life, the sun reaches its height, and this is the moment Jung studied more closely than any other, because it is the moment where, in his phrase drawn from the old Greek law, everything sooner or later runs into its opposite. He called it the grim law of enantiodromia, and what he meant was almost mathematical in its inevitability. The very intensity you built your morning identity with becomes, at noon, the thing that starts working against you. The ambitious young man from the second key, now 47, sits in his office, having gotten everything he set out to get, and finds the achievement strangely hollow, not because the achievement failed, but because the identity that pursued it has quietly finished its job and has nothing left to push toward. This is not a modern invention. I want to correct something here. The phrase midlife crisis did not come from Jung at all. It was coined decades later by a different psychologist studying career patterns, and the phrase life begins at 40 belongs to an entirely different writer from an earlier era. Jung's own language was quieter and stranger. He spoke of the afternoon of life needing its own program, its own values, because the values that built the morning cannot simply be run twice. And here is where I want to slow down, because the law of enantiodromia is not a single dramatic collapse. It is almost always 1,000 small reversals, arriving disguised as ordinary days. Imagine a woman who has spent 20 years as the capable one, the fixer, the reliable center of her family, and who at 50 finds herself furious for no clear reason, snapping at people she loves. And if she is willing to look, she may find that the fury is not really about the dishes left in the sink. It is the unlived side of her, the side that never got to rest, never got to want things only for herself, finally rising up because the persona that served her so well in youth has become too small a container for the whole of who she now is. Now follow her through an actual Tuesday, because this is where the law stops being an idea and becomes something you can almost touch. In the morning she is competent, organizing everyone's schedule before her own coffee is cold. By midday, she is quietly irritable answering an email that asks nothing unreasonable of her. By 4 in the afternoon, she snaps at her daughter over a coat left on the floor, a reaction far larger than a coat could ever deserve. And by evening, alone finally, she feels a strange flatness she cannot name. And if you asked her what happened today, she would say, nothing happened, and she would be wrong. Because what happened is that the shadow lengthened 3 separate times before dinner, 3 small eruptions of the very self she has been managing out of sight since she was 22. This is the shadow lengthening. Quite literally, at noon the shadow is shortest, almost invisible, and as the sun begins its descent, the shadow stretches longer and longer across the ground. And this is exactly what happens inside a person at midlife. The parts of the self that were pushed aside in order to build the persona of youth begin, one by one, to demand acknowledgement, not through some single reckoning but through these small daily leaks, an irritation here, a hollow evening there, a question that surfaces at 3 in the morning and is buried again by breakfast. This is not a breakdown, though it can certainly feel like one. It is closer to an invoice arriving for a debt quietly accumulated over 20 years, delivered not all at once but one modest installment at a time. And the honest question at this stage is never, how do I get back the certainty of my 30s? The honest question is, what has been waiting all this time in the lengthening shadow? And am I finally willing to look at it, not as an emergency but as a correspondence? A letter the noon years have been writing to you in an unfamiliar hand. I do not fight the turning of the sun. I ask instead what the lengthening shadow has been carrying for me. The fourth key is that old age has its own genuine task, and it is not simply decline dressed up in dignity. Jung was almost impatient with people who treated the later years as nothing more than a slow subtraction, a waiting room before an ending. He insisted instead that old age carries its own psychological work that youth is simply not equipped to do. And here is the shape of that work. Not expansion, but consolidation. Not building outward, but gathering inward, asking what all of it actually meant. And this is precisely where our culture offers almost no guidance at all. Think for a moment about how thoroughly we train the young. We hand them schools, mentors, career ladders, courtship rituals, an entire apparatus devoted to teaching a person how to build outward. And then, decades later, we hand the old almost nothing. No ritual, no apprenticeship, no elder to say, here is how you do this part well, so most people simply improvise old age out of fear. And Jung thought that improvisation, left untaught, tends to curdle into one of two shapes, either a bitter, clinging to the body's former strength, or a frightened refusal to look at what is actually approaching. In his own later years, Jung retreated often to a stone tower he had built with his own hands beside a lake at Bollingen. And there he did something almost nobody does anymore. He carved words into the stone himself. He sat with silence far longer than most people can bear. He treated the approach of death not as an emergency to be managed, but as a genuine chapter with its own weather and its own light. Imagine an old man who spends his final years only grieving the strength of his younger body, measuring every ordinary morning against some remembered peak he can never climb again, comparing the ache in his knees to the ease of his 30-year-old stride, and every comparison making the present day a little smaller, a little more like a consolation prize. Now imagine, beside him, an old woman in the very same decade of life, who spends those same mornings turning her attention toward what actually mattered, across the whole arc of her days, which relationships were real and which were performance, which ambitions were worth the cost, and which were simply inherited from someone else's expectations, what she still has left to say to the people she loves before she runs out of mornings to say it in. Both of them are aging at exactly the same rate. The calendar does not care which one of them chose better, but only one of them is actually completing the fourth movement, and the difference between them was never circumstance, it was orientation. One kept facing backward, toward a summer that had already ended, the other turned to face the harvest that was actually in front of her. Jung suggested, without pretending certainty about what lies beyond, that a life lived toward meaning, right up to its very edge, is psychologically healthier than a life spent refusing to look at the edge at all. Not because looking guarantees comfort, it does not, but because refusing guarantees a harvest never gathered, a whole field left standing in the frost. I do not need to solve the mystery of the ending, I only need to stop turning my back on it. The fifth key is where the whole picture starts to bite, because so far, this could sound like a tidy calendar. Childhood, then youth, then midlife, then old age. 4 rooms you simply walk through in order, but that is not how it actually works. And Jung was very clear that a person can be 60 years old in body and still be living, psychologically, entirely inside the second stage, still performing the morning program of youth, decades after morning has ended. So let me walk you through this slowly, in pieces, because this is the key that actually explains the suffering, not the calendar. First, consider the person who gets frozen in youth. Jung had a name for this pattern, the eternal youth. The person who keeps deferring the real commitments of adulthood indefinitely, always about to start the real career, always about to settle into the real relationship, always waiting for the perfect configuration of circumstances before truly beginning. Imagine a man of 55 still describing himself as someone with enormous unrealized potential, still speaking of his 20s as though they were last year, still unwilling to let the morning end. And what looks like youthful vitality from a distance is, up close, a refusal. A fear that if he ever actually commits, actually narrows down to one life instead of every possible life, he will have to face what all that deferred potential was actually protecting him from, namely, the ordinary, unglamorous risk of trying and possibly failing at something real. Second, consider the person frozen at noon, unable to let the shadow lengthen. This is the person who keeps doubling down on the identity of their 30s well into their 60s, the executive who cannot retire because retirement feels like death, the parent who cannot let a grown child leave because the identity of caretaker was the only identity that ever felt solid. Jung would say, this person has mistaken the persona for the whole self, and is now defending that mask with genuine desperation, because underneath it, unattended for decades, sits the very material the noon years were supposed to finally integrate. Third, consider the person who cannot enter old age at all, who treats every gray hair as an emergency, who fills every silence with noise, because silence is where the unasked questions live, and this is the saddest freeze of the four, because old age was meant to be the harvest, the gathering in of meaning, and a person who refuses to enter it arrives at the actual end of life, having never done the gathering, arriving empty-handed, not because life gave them nothing, but because they spent the final stage running from the very stillness that would have let them receive it. Now let me make this less abstract. Now, because it is easy to nod along to eternal youth and frozen noon as if they only describe other people, so picture an ordinary Tuesday. A woman wakes at 6, and for one honest moment, before the day gathers itself around her, she feels a flicker of something like grief. Not sharp, just a low hum under the morning. She pushes it down, because there is a commute, there is a meeting at 9, there is a version of herself waiting at the office who has no time for low hums. By 10, she is fully that version. Capable, sharp, exactly the woman she built in her 30s to survive that very room. At noon, she eats at her desk and scrolls past a photograph of an old friend who left the same job years ago to do something smaller and stranger and, from the outside, happier. And she feels a small hot flash of something she will not let herself name. By 3, she is defending a decision in a meeting more forcefully than the decision requires. By 6, she is home, and the house is quiet, and the hum from 6 that morning is still there, waiting, patient, unaddressed, and this is the whole mechanism in miniature. The task knocking was gather, was ask what it means, was let the old identity rest even for an hour, and instead, the day was spent reinforcing the very persona that task was trying to loosen, and she will very likely do the same thing again tomorrow, and the day after, not because she is foolish, but because no one ever taught her that the hum itself was the knock. Fourth, and this is the turn I actually want you to feel, none of these 3 people are strangers. One of them is very likely you, right now, tonight, in some corner of your own life. You may be 50 and still living by the morning program in your career, while your marriage quietly enters its own noon without you. You may be 30 and already frozen at an old man's caution, terrified of the very risk your actual age is asking you to take, refusing to build at all because building might fail. You may be 70 and still narrating your life as a list of achievements from 40 years ago, because sitting with what it all meant feels too much like sitting with an ending. The stages are not really about the calendar at all. Jung was insistent on this point. They are about tasks, and it is entirely possible to be behind in one and years ahead in another. Your body moves through the 4 stages whether you consent or not, but your psyche can lag decades behind, clinging to a stage whose task quietly finished long ago, still rehearsing lines from a play that closed years back. And the suffering you feel, the flatness, the restlessness, the low hum under an ordinary Tuesday, is not a sign that your life went wrong. It is the exact, precise sound of the gap between where your body stands and where your psyche has agreed to stand. So here is a small, honest exercise. Pause for a moment tonight and ask yourself plainly, what is the actual task knocking at my door this week? Not the task I performed at 25, Not the task I admire in someone else, just the one quietly present right now. Is it build? Is it stop and look? Is it gather? Is it rest into what is ending? Write down one true sentence naming it, and then notice how much energy you have been spending pretending a different task is the one that matters. Closing that gap is not glamorous work. It does not arrive as a single breakthrough. It looks like slowly, honestly admitting which stage's task you have actually been avoiding, and beginning, quietly, this week, in some small, unglamorous way, to do it. I stop performing the stage that has already finished with me. The sixth key is the gentlest one, and it is simply this. You do not find out which stage you are in by counting your birthdays. You find out by asking what task is actually knocking at your door tonight. And I want to make this almost embarrassingly concrete, because it is easy to nod along to talk of mornings and afternoons and still walk away without ever applying it to your own actual Tuesday. So imagine a woman sitting at her kitchen table at 9 in the evening, dishes done, house quiet, and her calendar says 53, her birth certificate says midlife. But her actual behavior that night says something else entirely. She is scrolling through job listings for a promotion she does not need, rehearsing an argument to prove she still has something to prove. And if you asked her which stage she was in, she would say without hesitation, "Oh, I am well into the second half now." And yet, everything she is doing at that table is morning behavior, building, proving, striving. The task knocking at her door that night was not build more. It was sit still and ask what any of this has actually meant. But she answered a different knock, the old familiar one, because it was louder and more comfortable than the new quiet one. And I tell you this story not to shame her, because most of us have sat at some version of that table. The point is simply this. The stages do not announce themselves with a bell. They knock softly, and it takes a kind of honesty most of us were never trained in to notice which knock is real tonight and which one is just habit, dressed up as urgency. So here is a small practice. Before you sleep tonight, sit for 1 minute, just one, and ask, not what should I be doing at my age, but what is actually asking to be done. Is it build something you have been avoiding starting? Is it stop and look at a shadow you have been outrunning with busyness? Is it gather the meaning of years you have been too rushed to notice? Is it simply be still with the ones you love, without performing anything at all? Whichever answer arrives first, honestly, without polish, that is very likely your real door tonight. And none of these 4 doors is a demotion. None of them is failure. The only real failure available to you is answering a door that already closed years ago, simply because the habit of answering it is familiar, and the new knock is strange. So let the strange knock in, even once, even tonight, and see what it actually wants from you. I meet the stage that is actually here, not the one I wish were here. Here is the whole picture. Childhood is the ground you did not choose, absorbing the atmosphere before there was a wall to keep it out. Youth is the necessary illusion, building outward with a conviction that has to feel absolute in order to work at all. Noon is the grim and honest law that everything runs into its opposite, the shadow lengthening exactly in proportion to how brightly the persona once shone. Old age is the harvest that our culture forgot how to teach, consolidation instead of collapse, meaning gathered instead of merely endured, and underneath all 4 sits the same single recognition that these were never 4 separate rooms you pass through once and leave behind. They are one continuous turning, the way up and the way down being, as Heraclitus said long before any of us, one and the same arc, and the only real failure available to you is not being behind or ahead, it is refusing to turn when your own life is quietly asking you to sown. So wherever you find yourself tonight, still building, or newly aware of a lengthening shadow, or finally sitting still enough to gather what it all meant, none of it is late, and none of it is wrong. It is simply the hour it is. Say it with me once more. I make the unconscious conscious. And again, I make the unconscious conscious. And I will leave you only with the question the whole of tonight has really been asking. Not which stage should you be in, but which one, honestly, quietly, is knocking at your door, right now,